Hi everyone, Jim of Shiloh Kahal again, and doing a second video here on Exodus 12, following up my video on Leviticus 23 because they're so closely associated and used so preeminently in the discussion of when a day begins. And again, like I did in the last video, you know, I have been testing and analyzing the scriptures that I have seen proffered as evidence for an evening to evening day, and how many are telling us that scriptures are speaking clearly that we have an evening to evening day. Well, I've been testing it and I don't find that. I find as I test and examine that I'm being pushed back to a morning to morning day because that's what makes sense. And is the fact that I think that many are they are given to trying to find evening to evening because that's what they've been given all along, and now they're trying to ratify it. And I just don't see how that's happening. But let me just say as quickly as I can that I don't have to be right in this. If others can prove what I'm saying wrong, I'm ready to take down videos. I'm ready to just stop and go a different direction because if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. I don't think so. I just think as I test this, I think that what they're saying is so evidential for an evening to evening is not evidential at all. In fact, if you really pay close attention, it's suggesting what seems more natural, which is a morning to morning. So let me just, with that, get started here with Exodus chapter 12. Okay, so as I turn to the scriptures, I'm going to select the King James Version. I prefer to read from the Yah scriptures or the Hallelujah scriptures because I just find that they're even more literal and do a better job of translating word for word the Hebrew and the Greek in both the New and Old writings, but it's just not as well accepted, and so I'm not going to introduce it in this video. I'm going to use the King James Version. I could use the NIV. I could use the New Living Translation, Holman Christian. I could use a lot of them, but I think that they'll all pretty much read the same way. But the King James Version just has the trust of most people. While they may prefer to read from the NIV or something like that, they all agree that the King James is, our most, one of our oldest and most trustworthy translations. So that's what I'm going to use. Let me just show you and confirm it. I go to Genesis. I go to just to show you what I'm working from. It is the King James Authorized Version. Using the standardized text of 1769, Strong's numbers added. So a little more information on the King James Authorized Version. And I'm moving to page 90, I believe it was 96, 95 and 96, which gets us to Exodus 12. And let me just kind of read. Remember, it's not the point of this passage to talk about the real essence of Exodus, which is, they're being delivered. They're in the process of being delivered from Mitzrayim, and we're getting ready to see judgment upon Mitzrayim and upon their gods. And we're going to have the destroyer go through and take out the firstborn of everybody. And prior to that, we're going to, the Israelites are being instructed to take a lamb and sacrifice it on the 14th day, which we'll read here in a second, and eat it that night and put the blood on the doorpost so that that night when the destroyer goes through, the destroyer passes over those who have the blood on their doorpost. But that's not the point of this video. The point of this video is because it's being used in the discussion of when a day begins, we're going to start pulling out the timing factors of this scripture. And it really begins in verse 6 of chapter 12. Here's chapter 12, and we go to verse 6, and it says, "And ye shall keep it," meaning the lamb without blemish. "We shall keep it up until the 14th day of the same month, which is the first month. And the whole assembly of the congregation shall kill it in the evening." Now, I've got these little asterisks here, and if we come down here, it reads in 12:6 in Hebrew, it reads between the two evenings. And in many of our translations, we'll see between the two evenings. And then we have the whole discussion of what that means, which I will address somewhat here as as well because it's important. But the King James reads that we're going to kill it in the evening. And we're going to take some of that blood and strike it on the two side posts and on the upper post wherein they shall eat it. So in the same place where they're going to eat it, they're going to put blood on the doorpost of the house. And they'll eat the flesh that night. What night? The 14th, the same night that they kill it. And that's the question. Is it the 14th or the 15th? That is the discussion. But no matter what, they're going to kill it in the evening. And that same night, they're going to eat it. No question about that, according to verse 8. Along with, they're going to roast it with fire and eat it with unleavened bread. Now, this is one of the confusions, is that in this command to eat the Passover, the Pesah meal that takes place that night, which is, I'm going to say it's on the 14th, but others are saying around the 15th because they start that, when the sun goes down, they're starting the 15th. But either way, that first night that they're eating that Pesah, that Passover meal, they're eating it with unleavened bread and with bitter herbs. And then we go on, we keep, now here in verses 9 and 9, it kind of gives us some more information about how to eat it. But then it says, and I'll just read it here in verse 10, it says, we're to let nothing of it remain until morning, and that which remains until morning we're to burn with fire. And thus, here's how we're supposed to eat it, but that's not the point. But he does say on verse 12, for I will pass through the land of Egypt this night. What night? The same night that they've killed the lamb, and will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And the blood shall be to you for a token upon the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. And then in verse 14, it will be, and this day, what day? I think it's still the 14th, but they're suggesting we've moved on into the 15th, or we've certainly mixed it at best, because they've got really the entirety of the Passover crossing days from the 14th into the 15th, which I'm going to show you if I can, hopefully succeed in that. Okay, so this day is to be kept a memorial for all generations. And then we go on to, in verse 15, where we now say, 7 days shall ye eat unleavened bread. Now, I think this has been a bit of a problem too, because I think many people think that because we're eating unleavened bread up here, that becomes during the Passover, the Pesah, that it becomes the first of these 7 days. I contend that it is not the first of these 7 days. We eat the Pesah meal or the Passover meal with unleavened bread, but then starting on the next day, the 15th, we begin the 7-day feast of unleavened bread, where we eat 7 more days of unleavened bread. The entirety of this period of time is 8 days, not 7. And I'll show it to you in a moment here, hopefully successfully. So 7 days we shall eat unleavened bread. And then in verse 16 it says, and there shall be an holy convocation, which is a Sabbath. And in the 7th day there shall be a holy convocation, which is a Sabbath. So on the first day, and this is important, the first day of what? This 7 days is a Sabbath. Well, the 14th was not a Sabbath. The first day of the 7 days is the Sabbath, and then the 7th day of this period of time is also a Sabbath, a holy convocation. And then in verse 18 it reads, in the first month, on the 14th day of the month at even, and this is important because at even should be the change of the day, which is what they're saying. But on the 14th day of the month at even, we're going to have to parse that out. Ye shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening, until the 21st, which is the 21st day of the month at even again. So from the 14th to the 21st, which is 8 days. 7 days there should be no leaven in your house, for whoever eats of leaven, etc. Okay, so that is the passage that we are examining here. Okay, and so I've built a bit of an outline here just to take what we just read and just put it in a quick outline form. In Exodus 12, verse 6, it says, we shall keep the lamb until the 14th day of the 7th month, at which time the whole assembly kills it in the evening, or in Hebrew, it's between the 2 evenings. In verse 8, they shall eat the flesh in that night. What night? Whatever. They kill it in the evening here, and that same night they're going to eat it. The question will be, is it the 15th or the 14th that we're eating it? And then we are to eat it with unleavened bread. So whatever we're eating that night is an unleavened bread meal. Verse 10, let nothing of this meal remain until morning. And verse 12, for I will pass through the land of Egypt this night and will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. I'm bringing that up because I think that's pertinent, and I'll show it to you in the outline and the illustration that I've got here in just a moment, because the 14th day is the Passover. It's the Pesah. And this passing over, the destroyer passing over, is the Passover, the Pesah. Okay, I'll come back to that. In verse 13, when I see the blood, I will pass over you. Verse 15, 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. Verse 16, on the first day of that 7 days, you'll have a holy convocation. And in the seventh day of those 7 days, you shall have a holy convocation. In verse 18, in the first month, on the 14th day of the month at even, you shall eat unleavened bread, which is the Pesah meal. This is what I contend. It's the Pesah meal. And then we have from the Pesah meal, which is the first time we eat unleavened bread, we add to that the 7 days of unleavened bread, which will get us to 8 days of eating unleavened bread. If we take the 14th, which is the day that we're going to eat the Pesah meal, then we have the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, 20th. That's 8 days of eating unleavened bread and not just 7. And that's because it includes the Pesah meal. This is my contention. And then in verse 23, for the Lord will, again, this is just reiterating, for the Lord will pass through to smite the Egyptian, and when he seeth the blood upon the lintel and on the two posts, the Lord will pass over the door and will not suffer the destroyer come into your houses to smite you. So this is the Passover. He will not suffer the destroyer to come into our houses. And what day what day is the destroyer coming through, and what day is he not suffering so that the destroyer passes over us? Is it the 14th or the 15th? Okay, and so to illustrate this, I have built this spreadsheet here, and it's a little busy, and I'm sorry, but I don't know how to not make it busy with what we're dealing with. So what I've done, just to kind of explain what I'm doing here, is I've got an evening to evening. If you can see this upper illustration with the color is an evening to evening illustration, and below it is a morning to morning illustration. So I'm going to lay this out. If we are working with a day that begins in the evening and we're measuring the Hebrew calendar, the Zadok calendar, the Enoch calendar by these days, and whether we start in the evening or start in the morning, then I'm going to lay it out on this timeline. So here on this evening to evening illustration, I have day one of this entire, I know Sean Griffin and some, they'll talk about how when in the Gospels we see them referencing Pesah, it's generally they tend to combine Pesah with unleavened bread, which I agree in the scriptures they do that, or in the new writings they do that a lot, so that when they're referencing, hey, upcoming is the Pesah, they're talking about the entire 8-day event, because it's an 8-day event that begins on the 14th and ends on the 21st, 8 days later. So they'll often call the whole thing Pesah. Or they might call the whole thing unleavened bread, but they run them together often. But they are two separate Moedim. We have the Pesah on the 14th, and then we have the Moedim, or the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that begins on the 15th and runs to the 21st. No matter how they do it in the new writings, the technical, the true, the real way to do it is to have a separate Moedim of Pesah and a separate Moedim week of unleavened bread. So with that, let's start here with the Pesah, and let's take, because this is the contention that, and I'm contending against it, but the contention for it says that Exodus 12, along with Leviticus 23, is arguing and not just arguing, it's affirming. I mean, they just say it unequivocally that these are proof that it's evening to evening, and at best, it's not proof. At best, it would be evidence for something. But even then, I think the entire timeline works against evening to evening. But let me illustrate and show you what I mean. So on day one, if you are beginning on the 14th day, first of all, if you go evening to evening, what's the very first thing that happens? Evening. So when you say evening on the 14th, you're talking about the very first thing. Now, across this line here, these are little suns, because these are This is the beginning. So this is, the sun has gone down in the evening and it has begun the day. So the very first thing that's happening on day 14 is evening. If you think evening of the 14th is just before the 15th, then you're not going evening time. Forgive me, I don't mean to say it with the wrong spirit. I'm just saying, if you think that the evening before the evening of the 14th is just before the 15th begins, then I don't know how one of us is misunderstanding your evening to evening concept, because when the sun goes down and the evening begins, you're starting a day. So the very first thing when we're talking about evening on the 14th is the very first thing that happens. And we have got 12 hours of night and then 12 hours a day before we ever get to the evening of the 15th. So when we go to the passage, and give me a second. Okay, so when we come back to the passage, and we're starting in verse 6 here, and we shall keep what? The lamb until the 14th day of the month. So we're keeping the lamb until this day. And if you're going evening to evening, it's this whole day that you've got to keep the lamb. But then it's saying that we have to, we've got to kill it in the evening. We're going to kill it in the evening on the 14th. Okay, in the evening at the end of the 14th, I suppose, if you want to be clear, that what would that be? If you go to the evening of the 14th, first of all, here's the evening of the 14th. If we were to kill it on the 14th, we're killing it at the beginning of the 14th. If we're keeping it until the evening of the 15th, okay, but we're not killing it on the 14th anymore. As soon as the sun goes down, we're killing it on the 15th. And then I'm questioning whether or not we even really have a Passover if we're doing it that way. So the very first point that I'm making, and to that, let me add a verse 18. Forgive me. So verse 18 reads, in the first month, on the 14th day of the month at even. So it's not leaving anything to question here that we're talking about the 14th day at even. Let's go back to so what is the 14th day at even? If this is the even, it's the first thing that happened on the 14th. And it's a full 24 hours before we ever even get to the 15th. Okay, so here's even. If we're keeping it if we're keeping it till this period of time, beginning the 15th, then we're not keeping it till even on the 14th. We're keeping it to even on the 15th. And we have a problem, I think, with scriptures then. So, okay. So here we are again. Here's the beginning, and the evening is the beginning of the day. That's what I'm illustrating here. Starting with the night, the evening begins the night, and the evening starts the day, and it begins the Pesah. So the Pesah begins at evening, runs through the night, and then runs through the daylight hours. The second half of Pesah would be the daylight hours. We have 12 hours of darkness, then 12 hours of light. And to visit the conversation about, like the King James says that we're to kill the lamb in the even on the 14th, which it would be here if we're on the 14th. But King James says even, but the Hebrew reads between the evenings. Well, I've done a lot of study on this, and there are some competing concepts of what that means. There are some folks that say that ered means darkness. So they're saying that the Hebrew reads between the darknesses. And what would the darknesses be? It could be this is a darkness and this is a darkness. So the whole thing could be between this darkness and this darkness, or this is darkness, and it could be between that and that darkness. That's a possibility. If you're going to call this evening and this evening over here, if you can see what I'm pointing at, you've got the evening of the 14th and the evening of the 15th. If you're going to say between the evenings, then you have the whole, and the beginning of the night is the only definition of an evening, then you would have a 24-hour period of time where the command is you're going to kill the Pesah between the evenings. So when it gets dark here, you're going to have to kill the lamb between the time of it gets dark and then but by the time it gets dark again on the 15th. And there is another potential meaning, and that is that rather than darkness or evening, it could be between the twilights, because when we get into twilights, and let me illustrate. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut off there, but let me illustrate this for you. Here's a drawing of a day here. If you can see this to the right, we have this little sunrise here. Right now it's below the horizon. This line here is the horizon, or this horizontal line across here. And to the right is a little yellow sun, and they're showing it below the horizon. As it breaks the horizon, we're going to start the daylight period of time, which runs in this sky blue color here. And then we're going to have the sun go beneath the horizon, and we're going to enter this twilight period where we have a mixture of light, where the sun has gone down, but its radiation continues to light up the sky even without it being in the sky. And so we have this period of, and I'll just show you real quickly. Here's the we start, once it starts going down, we first have a civil twilight, then we have a nautical twilight, then we have an astronomical twilight, then we have astronomical dusk. And the nighttime begins, which is right here. And then we have this period of darkness here. And then as the sun is approaching and coming around again, its light begins to touch the sky, even though it hasn't gone. Then we start with a astronomical dawn, and then we have an astronomical twilight, a nautical twilight, a civil twilight, and then the sun breaks the horizon and we have day. So one of the potential is that when it says between the twilights, we are talking about this twilight and this twilight. So the Pesah would be killed or slaughtered between the two twilights, which would be basically during the daylight hours of the day. Now, I will also say, though, that I've seen information that suggests that you're to kill the lamb just before twilight, and then there's, I believe it's in Jubilees, that it says that you're to kill the lamb when there's no light left. There's a little bit of confusion that is probably more related to translations and other problems we have with getting original Hebrew and the original Word of God to us in correct form, which is an ongoing battle. But still, I think it's pretty clear when we come back to, go ahead and close these down. When we come back to when we should be doing this between the evenings, one thing is for sure, it needs to be killed before this period of time here, somewhere around here, which I'm going to point up here, which is the end of day 14 and on this evening to evening, which would also then put it in the beginning of day 15. Okay, so for those who are buying into the evening to evening or proffering the evening to evening, then you're going to kill the lamb at the end of this day. And then because you are starting your day, your next day in the evening, you immediately go to the 15th. Well, that presents some problems, I think, because now we've started our day, evening has begun the day, and two things have happened. We've also begun our Feast of Unleavened Bread. We've gone, we had this uneventful first half of the Pesah, and then we had this 12 hours of Pesah here where we basically kill the lamb. And then almost immediately we start the Feast of Unleavened Bread at the same time that we're going to eat the Pesah and everything. We're commingling. We're commingling the 14th and 15th day, because when the sun goes down and the activity of eating the Pesah with unleavened bread, which I'm showing you down here, we have this activity beginning that night, because there's no question that the scriptures tell us that we're going to kill the lamb on the 14th that evening and eat it that night. So we're eating it here. And the question is whether we're on the 15th day or the 14th day. And if you're going evening to evening, you have us on the 15th day. And everything that's occurred with the sun going down is we've started a new day, which not only started a new day, it started a new Moedim. We have the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And we're going to eat the Pesah not on Pesah anymore, but we're going to be eating the Feast of Passover on the first day of unleavened bread, the Moedim of unleavened bread. And we have another problem, and that is that we have the angel of death, or the destroyer, coming through this night, because we're eating, and it's while they're eating, they're eating, that the destroyer comes through, and when he sees the blood on the post around midnight, he passes over them. So if this is Passover, if you're going evening to evening, the destroyer is actually going through, not on the 14th on the Hebrew calendar, on the Zadokian calendar, on the Aaronic calendar, on the Enoch calendar, but he's going through on the 15th, not even going through on the 14th. So basically, the only thing we did on the 14th was kill the lamb, and that's it. If you're going evening to evening, the only thing that has happened on the 14th is that you've killed the Pesah, and maybe that's enough, but everything else is happening on the 15th. We're eating the dinner. We've started the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The destroyer comes through and passes over. All that's happening on the 15th day, and we have to destroy it by morning on the 15th day as well. And then, because in this context, they think this eating of the Passover bread becomes the first of the unleavened breads, then they have 7 days of unleavened bread. We have, I believe, let me count it up here. We got day 15, 1, 16, 2, 17, 3, 18, 4, 19, 5, 26, 21st, 7. So this is why this is another reason they're offering that this Pesah, that this unleavened bread has to be the first of these unleavened bread, of the 7 days of unleavened bread, because we're eating unleavened bread. And it needs to be 7 days because that's what it's clear. We were supposed to have a Sabbath here, and I've got the Sabbath listed here on the first day of this Moedim and on the seventh day. So the first day we're eating unleavened bread, and the seventh day, it should only be 7 days of eating unleavened bread according to this thought process, which I just don't. I know why they're having that thought process. I just don't know why it's necessary, and it's complicating everything. Now, let me show you a potential juxtaposed against that is this morning to morning, and how it works so much better and more and seamlessly with what I am trying to offer, and see if it doesn't make better sense of what we just read in Exodus. So in this morning to morning illustration, so if you start in the morning, what happens? You have the Pesah, which is the first day that begins when the sun comes up. And we have this period of time then. We have this 12 hours of daylight, which maybe if you're going twilight to twilight, which I've got between the evenings here, and I didn't lay it out very well here. No, I guess I did lay it out pretty well, because between the evenings would be, the darkness here. If you're going to have between the twilights, I mean, you would have the twilight of the morning and then the twilight of the evening. And so you would be killing the lamb within the 12 hours of daylight period, which makes sense to me, because the command is we're going to kill the Pesah at even. There's no question. But if we're going morning to morning, when we reach that evening period, we're still in day 14. So we're killing the Pesah on the 14th at even. And we begin to eat the Pesah with unleavened bread, because we're commanded to eat that first meal, which is the Pesah with unleavened bread. We're still eating it on the 14th. So we kill the Pesah, we begin to eat with unleavened bread throughout the evening hours, throughout the nighttime hours. And while we're eating, the destroyer, or the angel of death, comes through at midnight, still on the 14th, still on the day of Pesah, still on the day of Passover. We haven't changed days. So really we have, if we go morning to morning, we have a very full Pesah, a very full Passover. If you go back up here to the evening, the only thing we have nothing going on in the nighttime hours, the first half of Pesah. And then in the second half, all we do is kill the Pesah on the Pesah. All of the things that happen that night are all considered the 15th. But if we go morning to morning, it's all still the Pesah. That's why we have, to me, it seems pretty evident that that's why we have the Pesah. It's a full day. It is a day unto itself. So we wake up and we have the 12 hours of daylight. And as we're approaching evening, we're to kill our Pesah. And then we're to prepare our Pesah in haste, and to eat it with unleavened bread and herbs. And while we're eating it, the destroyer comes through, and Elohim does not suffer him to visit them because of the blood over the doorpost. And now we have the Pesah. And then the command is that we're not to keep any of the Pesah until the morning. So we're destroying it morning, which is the beginning of the 15th day, which is the beginning of the second Moedim, which is the beginning of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. We're beginning this. It's also the beginning of our first day of Shabbat. When we do this, we're keeping this Shabbat. This becomes our first day of the 7 days. If we can lose the idea that we can only have 7 days of unleavened bread, and you can embrace the idea that no, we have a Moedim, a 7-day long period of Moedim for unleavened bread, associated with the unleavened bread. But on the Pesah that just happened, that first day of the 8-day period is also we're to eat unleavened bread. So we have 8 days of eating unleavened bread. I see nothing in Scripture that tells us that that's not appropriate. And I think to find that we can only have 7 days of unleavened bread, can't have that eighth day of unleavened bread that occurs on the Passover because you are thinking that the whole thing can only be 7 days. I think that's introduction. That is eisegeting into Scripture, in my opinion, because the whole thing continues to work. So we have this full day of Passover, and then we have the first day of unleavened bread where we're keeping Sabbath and we're eating unleavened bread. And then we have the second day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, third day of Feast of Unleavened Bread, fourth day of Feast of Unleavened Bread, fifth day of Feast of Unleavened Bread, sixth day of Feast of Unleavened Bread, and then on the seventh day Feast of Unleavened Bread, we have the Shabbat again. And we're commanded to eat unleavened bread until the even of the 21st day. So in this scenario, that means that when the sun goes down, I guess it seems like there would be potential for you to eat leavened bread if that's what you so desired, because the requirement to eat unleavened bread ended at even, according to Exodus anyway. Which is kind of like the Leviticus statement, where really that Shabbat would end when the sun goes down on the 10th day. The Shabbat actually ends because the Shabbat, which was an even to even 24-hour Shabbat, began with the ninth day. The second half of the ninth day ran through the first half of the 10th day. And so neither the first half of the ninth day nor the second half of the 10th day was Shabbat in that scenario. So let me say, if this is true, and I think it is, I just think it is, because when you take this whole Passover, this Pesah timeline, moves into the Gospels, and we move into the accounts of what Yahushua went through in those last hours and days of his life, where we introduce the timeline of the Pesah, the Passover, and how they celebrated, how he sent his Talmidim, his apostles, in to go, or his disciples in to go and prepare for it. Then they eat it that night when it became even. And many are arguing with that once they started eating, it was the 15th. I'm saying it's still the 14th. Let me, if you apply this, and I've got other videos out there, I'm not going to do it here, but I've got videos out there where I have applied this approach to that timeline of the last week, the crucifixion week of Yahushua, our Messiah. And it makes it work. It just works. I think it works so well. But okay, so this is the linear line of what the Pesah and then the 7 days of unleavened bread would look like, both evening to evening and morning to morning. Let me show you quickly what it would look like on a calendar. This is a 7-day calendar, and this is, based upon the days, there would be, and I'm not getting into it here, but there would be reasons why some of these days might be different days, as you try to tie it in with the Gregorian calendars and, the world calendar today. But what can't really vary, according to the Enoch calendar and the Zadok calendar, the calendars of Aaron, is that the first day of, the first day of every year is going to start on the fourth day of the week. And every Passover, every Pesah is going to start on this third day of the week. And every festival of Matzah, which is the Feast of Unleavened Bread, is going to start on the fourth day and run through the third day of the next week. Another thing to point out, since the Passover week is so tied to the gospel accounts, one thing to keep in mind is that the first day of the festival of Matzah is a Shabbat. So there are some references to Mary and those folks keeping the Shabbat. Well, are they keeping and that the people wanted him off of the cross so that they could celebrate Shabbat. Well, it wasn't the weekly Shabbat they were trying to celebrate. It was this high Shabbat related to the festival of Matzah, for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So they had this festival of Unleavened Bread Shabbat, and then a few days later they had the weekly Shabbat. So really, in the timeline that I would embrace, they go, Yahushua and his disciples get the Passover, they kill the Passover lamb, and they eat the Passover lamb in the evening here, and then at nighttime actually, And then all the events that took place, in the garden took place on Passover. And then we have the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which was a Shabbat, which would be the day that Yahushua was killed. And then I contend that he was risen, that he was raised on first thing on this Shabbat here, the seventh day, which is the third day in the earth. So we have another Shabbat that takes place there, and then we have a third Shabbat that takes place on the third day of the week, which is the seventh day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And so the timelines of the Gospels are also offered up then as evidences of an evening to evening, but I say that it's not. There are no more evidences of evening to evening than Exodus 12 was. In fact, it again works against evening to evening and for morning to morning. Let me also, as I close here, let me also share that if you have been listening to anything that I'm sharing, by the time at 175 BC, an apostate priesthood took over for the Aaronic priesthood. The sons of Zadok were kicked out. The last of them were kicked out, and we ended up with Hellenistic priests, and then we had the Hasmonean priests that took over, and they were not the legitimate priesthood of Israel. And with that, they were accommodating things going on with Greece and the calendar systems of Greece, which I think they were probably Babylonian-based calendars, which probably did go evening to evening. But it is likely, in my opinion, that the introduction of an evening to evening and these problematic doctrines of the Pharisees and the Sadducees all began, it maybe started before them, but it certainly got its foothold when the Hellenistic priests and the Hasmonean priests, who were not Aaronic priests, sons of Aaron, were able to take over and get control and power so they could begin giving us bad doctrine. They gave us the things that Yahushua and John and Paul all fought against, and that is the oral traditions, the traditions of men that were not Torah of Elohim. And so my point of that in bringing this up again is that by the time of Yahushua, which would have been 3 AD and through 3 BC or whatever it was, 2, 3, 4 BC through 27, 30 AD, during the period of time after the Hasmoneans have taken over and the illegitimate priesthood is in place at the time of Yahushua, well, they would have been practicing a wrong calendar by that period of time. So what we see in the Gospels, and if you're not careful, I think probably the Gospels assumed people would know that, but here we are 2,000 years later, and we didn't know that any more than we as a church are really aware of what happened in AD 70 and how Jerusalem was destroyed and what that really meant to Israel. There's so much ignorance related to that, and there's so much ignorance related to what took place in the couple of centuries before Yahushua came on board. Things that they would have presumed back then that we don't know now. In fact, we've been giving other presumptions, other information that now become the background, the backdrop to what we were understanding. So by the time we're reading the gospel accounts and we are watching Yahushua being crucified and then them worrying about him getting off of the stake because the Shabbat is approaching, they want to get him down because they want to be able to eat their Passover. Well, they're doing this on the 15th. They're doing this on the day after Yahushua just kept his Passover, that they're trying to keep their Passover, and they're introducing the Shabbat. Well, the reason you can't make it line up is because you have the illegitimate people keeping one calendar system, and then you have the legitimate, the Zadoks, the Aaronic priesthood, John the Baptist and Yahushua, keeping the real calendar, and they are not aligned. They are not keeping, you have two calendars taking place with the leadership through the Pharisees and the Sadducees keeping one calendar, while the legitimate priesthood and Yahushua are keeping a different calendar. And if you don't factor that in, it will confuse you. All right, well, forgive me. This one took 40 minutes. I didn't mean for it to get that long. I'm trying to keep them short, but I don't know how to do it and still get all the information in that I need, that I feel like I need to. But anyway, thank you for, I hope I hope this all made sense. I hope I was clear in what I was doing, what I've said to you. Thank you for spending time with me, and may you be Baruch.